A friend of mine asked me to create a short video describing this program that I created and website that allows us to evaluate our investments based on the S&P 500. Now, I did this as part of a blog post, but for those who don't really like to read through blogs, this will just give you a quick overview of what this program does. I created a small program that basically looks at the performance of the S&P 500 over the last close to 100 years. Even though the S&P 500 has grown about 9% per year, that's not really accurate in terms of how things work in reality, right? Because sometimes you can have a down year and sometimes you can have an up year. So you can see that here, and I pointed this out in my blog. So this allowed me to initially take a starting year, 1941, and let's say you have $1.7 million in your investments and you want to take out $80,000 a year. You can calculate it using dollars. So this is my initial investment of 1.73 million, withdrawing 80,000. So you could see you lost some money this first year in 1941 if you followed the returns that the S&P 500 gave, because you took out $80,000 and you also lost 11.5%. But the next year you took out another 80,000, but it grew by 20%. The next year 25%, and so on. You could see back in 1946 it lost about 8%. So it's having, these are the traditional fluctuations of positive and negative growth. I also looked at 25 years ahead. So if you were, say, 62 years old, now you'd be 87 years old. And by taking $80,000 out every year, you'd have about 38 million in there. Now, of course, that doesn't always work, because let's try 1929 and calculate using dollars. So here, if I took out in 1929, I took out the 80,000, but I also lost 8%, then I lost 24%, then I lost 43%. And you go through here and you get slammed again in 1937, and pretty soon, in 1943, you would now have no money left in your savings. So the next thing I did was I said, let's calculate it for every year. So this is saying, let's assume we retired in 1929, and this is what my portfolio would look like over the next 25 years. Now I'm going to say, let's do it for every year. And we'll do a 25-year horizon again. Now when I do it, if I had started in 1926, that was the beginning rate for that year, after the 25 years, you'd have $4 million in your account. If you did it in 1927, you'd have about 4 million. You could see here, you will lose money in 1929 and 1930. 25 years after 1929, we saw before that we eventually went out to zero, and also in 1930. But look, if you had started in 1931, just after the crash, you got destroyed. You lost 43%, but you survived, and you had you had a 53% growth, a 47% growth, a 33%. So you could absorb that 35%. So over 25 years, starting in 1931, you'd have $4 million. And let's just scroll down. Here we're in a little bit of trouble in the year 2000, the dot-com bubble. So from 2000 to 2025, you'd have about 1.4 million left. If you started in 2001, after 25 years, you'd have 3.6 million. Now we have this not a number, NaN. That's because we're in 2026. So 25 years from now, we don't have the ability to measure that. If I wanted, I could lower this to 20 years, calculate for every year, and you could see now I can move into 2006 because it's 2026. So in 20 years, we'd have quite a bit of money in here. Again, in 2000, we can look 20 years ahead and what was left in our savings. What I wanted to do now, I have other buttons, but the other button I wanted to show you is calculate every year using an increased withdrawal. So in this case, I want to withdraw $80,000 initially, but then to adjust for inflation, I'm going to increase my withdrawal by 2.5%. So this is completed. And again, if you look here, you would see in 1926, I would have withdrawn $80,000. Then you keep increasing it. Now let's do 25 years instead. You would increase it by 2.5%. So by the time you're 87, you'd have $2 million. You would have been withdrawing $148,000. Now, the other thing I did is I included what I call the interdecile range. Now, I lose money here. In other words, you would run out of money if you kept taking out $80,000. You'd eventually run out of money. But here you're making a ton of money, right? Right after in World War II. So in this case, I don't want to necessarily look at what's the lowest return and what's the highest. I wanted to look at the middle 80%. Now, there's 76 different years where I can have a 25-year look ahead to see how the S&P 500 would have done with 1.7 million, taking out $80,000 a year and increasing it by 2.5%. And that means that's going to range from 1.3 million to 27.5 million. That's sort of the middle, the fat part of your curve. I drop out the lowest 10% of the returns. Clearly, these numbers would be in the lowest 10%, and I drop out the highest 10%. So probably this 36 million would be one of those as well. Oh, here's 162 million. That wouldn't be included. So you have about an 80% chance under the historical S&P 500 to get between 1.3 million and 27 million. What's nice about this is you can start to play some games. Let's say I have 1.93 million instead of 1.73. And let's go back here to these years where, again, during the Great Depression, it wasn't in good shape. And all of a sudden now you've just made it, right? By the hair of your chinny chin chin here. All right, so you just made it here. But you've lost in these 2 years. So we'd still run out of money. But what if you said, let's start at taking out 60,000 a year? And all of a sudden you'd make it in every year except 1928. And then you come down. Again, you can see some very large returns. And in that case, we're between 5.8 million and 36 million, 80% of the time. So this would be an example. If this was me, I'd say, I'm in pretty good shape for retirement if I choose to only take out 60,000. Let's take out 100,000. If I do that, well, now we've got a lot more years that we could be losing money if I were to take out $100,000 every single year. So in this case, we lose money to having $29 million. And of course, if you hit a bad year, you might get a second job or adjust things. So this is doing some things without any kind of real adjustments. But I would encourage you now to work through this site yourself, especially for this calculating every year using an increased withdrawal, and test out things. See how much money you have in your retirement account, how much money you might want to take out every year, how much you might want to increase that to accommodate the results of inflation. And this will show you how you did. So if you had a little over 2 million and you took out 90,000, now you would have between 2.5 and 33 million. Let's move this back to 100,000 again. Yep, so you'd just barely make it here, but you'd have upwards of $31 million. And you can see the years. Again, those Great Depression years are a problem. And that dot-com bubble, where you're eventually going to hit 9/11 and you're going to hit the housing collapse in 7 years, you could run out of money. You might need to, again, change some of your expectations. And still you'd run out. What if I took out 80,000 in that time? Well, in that case, you'd make it. So that's a little bit safer of a bet. So have fun with this, and I'll just give you a general idea of maybe how you're doing as you plan for a retirement that might be just around the corner. Next video I'll create will be for our children to help them think about, as they're starting their careers, how much should they actually invest to see how much they'll have in their account in, say, 30 years when they're ready to retire.